To get to the notion of meal replacement shakes, we need to talk about the larger issue of military food, and especially in the form of combat-ready rations, and how the military and the development of food has influenced just about everything we can find in the supermarket. In her recent book, Combat Ready Kitchens, Anastasia Marx de Salcedo has documented how military research and development has influenced just about everything that we can find in the supermarket. Salcedo's book looks at the work done by the Combat Feeding Directorate at the U.S. Army Soldier Research, Development, and Engineering Center in Natick, Massachusetts. In this paper, we look less at the technology of combat rations, but more at the concept of eating embodied in combat-ready rations and the impact on how we talk about food in civilian contexts. We look at the relationship between the concept of combat rations and civilian eating from 5 theoretical perspectives. First, we look at this relationship from the perspective of cultural transfer. By cultural transfer, we are referring to the global mobility of words, concepts, images, and objects. Second, we examine combat-ready rations and civilian equivalents from the perspective of Belasco's distinction between dining and feeding. While all creatures feed, only humans, according to Belasco, dine. Third, we apply Mary Douglas's taxonomy for deciphering a meal to deciphering a meal ready to eat. That's the military designation of combat food. Fourth, we examine the concepts of individual servings and solitary eating from the broader perspective of the increasing process of individualization. Individualization is the process by which the individual is becoming the central unit of social life. So, to go back to military food and combat-ready rations, they're built upon the modern notion of the meal ready to eat. Okay, so this is an individual meal, and it constitutes about 1,200 calories, and you would eat 3 of these in a day to get to the required amount of sustenance for a day of combat. These are used wherever operational rations cannot be issued or prepared. So where you're in a combat situation where you can't set up a field kitchen. They usually have a standard of a 3-year shelf life, and they are pretty standardized. There are about 24 menus, but there are some menus which are special purpose menus. For example, there is a meal religious kosher allow. What do they consist of? Well, they usually consist of 3 particular elements. They consist of a 3-course meal, which consists of an entree, a side dish, and a dessert. And they come with an FRH, which is a flameless ration heater. So the flameless ration heater, you put some water in it, and there's a chemical reaction which heats the water, and then you pop inside the entree, and then in about 10 minutes it heats it to a temperature of about 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The MRE also comes with an accessory pack, which used to, until about 1975, contain tobacco. The data for this study, the language data, comes from 2 main sources. We looked at, firstly, the periodical reports of the Combat Feeding Directorate, the CFD, from a period between 1950 and 2015, and that's about 175,000 words. And we also looked at a civilian corpus of written and spoken and visual text taken from the promotional materials for Hot Pockets and Soylent. Soylent is the meal replacement shake. Um, let's start by having a look at this particular Hot Pockets ad. It's called Hunger Can't Kill My Game. And it's a really neat example of cultural transfer. The ad shows the transfer from real to virtual combat. But the process, of course, is far more complex. The notion of cultural transfer needs to have very complex metaphors to actually capture what's happening in the notion of cultural metaphor. Anyway, you can stop now and then you can look at this particular ad, Hunger Can't Kill My Game. The commercial product Hot Pockets actually preceded the military development of the pocket sandwich. Hot Pockets were first developed in 1983. The military's pocket sandwich, with a minimum shelf life, of course, of 3 years, and heated in an FRH, was developed almost 20 years later. It's interesting just to quote some of the language that's used to describe this particular development. Um, I'm quoting here from the Natick corpus from the report of the CFD. Current military doctrine requires troops to be highly mobile, agile, and sustainable under any environmental condition, climate, and location. Oftentimes, the warfighter does not have the time to stop and prepare a meal. An eat out of hand, eat on the move capability is required for these situations. And so there's an interesting cultural transfer here back and forth. So between the real combat and the virtual combat, the military has long partnered with electronic game producers in the development of combat simulations. The use of the term warfighter is very much the state-of-the-art term used by Natick, more to refer to combat troops, and especially since 1990. In 2011, the Department of Defense, the DoD, had wanted to replace warfighter with the term soldier. However, from 2006 onwards, there is a long list of first-person shooter games with warfighter in the title. Ghost Recon Advanced Warfighter came out in 2006. Ghost Recon Advanced Warfighter 2 came out in 2007. And then Medal of Honor Warfighter came out in 2012. It's interesting to think about cultural transfer here, whether the Combat Feeding Directorate actually persevered with the term warfighter because of the video games and their particular success. I mean, it's a really important tool of recruitment if you can go between the virtual combat of a video game and the real combat of the military. Another aspect to cultural transfer can be seen in the way that military food has been spiced up. Hispanics in the Army have grown from 3% to 17% in the last 30 years. So we could talk about how the military it reflects this increasing demographic by its increasing incorporation of this kind of food into their menus. It should also be noted that this also reflects the civilian diet, whether Hispanic or not. So in a sense, the militaries kind of reflect trying to appeal to the kinds of foods that soldiers would normally eat. One of the interesting one there is the introduction of Tabasco 2011. It was actually introduced in 1987, but it took them about almost 20 years to develop the kinds of technology which would allow them to package it in such a way so that the Tabasco didn't eat through the packaging. That was the case with small bottles of Tabasco at the beginning. Okay, the second concept we're looking at here in terms of looking at combat ready rations is the distinction between feeding and dining. Belasco argues that dining is much more than feeding. Dining is distinctly human. Belasco goes on to argue that there are four necessary components of a cuisine. Firstly, there's a set of basic foods. Second, a method of preparing the food. And three, a distinct flavors. And four, a set of manners. If these are absent in the situation of the consumption of individual combat rations, does it make it feeding? Leaving aside the question of whether the consumption of combat rations can be defined as dining or feeding, we can at least mark the difference between feeding and eating in terms of language use. The CFD states often the importance of feeding rather than eating, and no mention of dining, of course. And it's interesting to note that best fed is not defined. So if we look at the kind of language that's used here, and this is from the mission statement of 2015, and let's just read it through. The mission of the DoD Combat Feeding Program is to ensure that America's warfighters are the best fed in the world by investing in high-risk, high-payoff science and technology and utilizing continuous product improvement, CPI. CFD provides warfighters with revolutionary combat feeding capabilities. You can see by the use of those dense noun phrases are high risk, high payoff science and technology, continuous product improvement, and revolutionary combat feeding capabilities. It's the kind of language we're very familiar with in corporate speak. When we look at Hot Pockets, we can see a similar stress on feeding. Hot Pockets has targeted a particular demographic of males living together. Hunger in this situation is an annoying interruption of having fun. And then food is seen as a fuel, allowing a speedy return to fun. I'm going to have a look at, we're going to look at an ad from Hot Pockets house. And in this ad, the ad depicts a scene that resonates with Combat Feeding Director's description of its pocket sandwich. So you can stop now and you can have a look at that ad. Okay. So if we go back to the CFD, their particular rationale for combat ready rations, they say oftentimes the warfighter does not have the time to stop and prepare a meal. And eat out of hand, eat on the move capability is required for these situations. So once you've seen the ad and the kinds of eating while skydiving, you might want to wonder whether this is possibly could remotely be called dining. It looks a lot more like feeding rather than dining. If we look again in terms of this distinction of feeding and dining with regard to Soylent, what we find is that these particular Soylent, the meal replacement shake, is targeted at cubicle workers, office workers, who often do not have the time to stop and prepare a meal. They too need an eat out of hand, eat on the move capability. Hence the popularity of these meal replacement shakes. So, a meal replacement shake is one example of what is called life hacking. Life hacking is the streamlining of the obligations of daily life, and in an attempt to free up time for whatever you'd rather be doing. So, eating is messy, it takes time, you have to think about it. If you can remove all those particular pressures of eating or dining, then you have more time to do fun stuff or more time to do work. So, silent is similar to hot pockets in this way. Hunger is an interruption of work, athletic activity. The third concept we want to look at in terms of combat ready rations is the work done by Mary Douglas in her seminal 1971 paper. Mary Douglas is a symbolic anthropologist, and her particular paper is an attempt to decipher a meal by breaking the meal down into certain classifications. Um, what she attempted was a syntagmatic analysis of a meal, and especially the meal that she, as a home cook, serves up in her family, to her family in her London middle class home in the 1970s. So she classifies meals units from the largest to the smallest. She talks about weekly menus, daily menus, meals, courses, helpings, and the smallest morpheme in her analysis is the mouthful. And she identifies the specific food types that make up a meal. For example, an antipasto, meat dishes, grilled fish, etc., pudding, and so forth. At the same time, we get a description of Mary Douglas as an embattled, if not enslaved, home cook. And I'm just going to read from her paper, which really provides the rationale for why she attempted this particular classification. So she says, sometimes at home, hoping to simplify the cooking, I ask, would you like to have just soup for supper tonight? I mean, a good thick soup instead of supper. It's late and you must be hungry. It won't take a minute to serve. Then the argument starts. Let's have soup now and supper when you are ready. No, 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 no. To serve two meals would be more work. But if you like, why not start with the soup and fill up with pudding? Good heavens! What sort of meal is that? A beginning and an end and no middle. So that's the kind of experience which Mary Douglas had as a home cook, which inspired her to begin to think of how people conceive of a meal and how they classify a meal. So this is just a part of her classification of a meal, and it's a very tantalizingly brief and incomplete analysis that really needed to be elaborated beyond the short paper she wrote about it. Okay, so as you can see, we have start with the daily menu, but she also talks about prior to a daily menu, there is a weekly menu. For example, we have Sunday roast. I mean, it's a typical British middle class home. And then Monday probably would be stew, which would be made out of the leftovers of the roast. And maybe there was fish on Friday. And she also mentions special holiday meals and birthdays. Um, and then she goes on to talk about uh, other particular parts of the classification. She has daily menu, and then in the daily menu, of course, we have breakfast, lunch, dinner, etc. She talks about particular meals, so she breaks down each meal. So, for example, if you break down a breakfast, it could be a different type of breakfast, a continental breakfast, a full breakfast, an English breakfast. And then she looks at courses. For example, if you look at dinner, you can break down dinner into antipasto, entree, dessert, cheese, etc. And then you can begin to break down the entree into, for example, if it's fish, what kind of fish? Is it fried? Is it poached? Is it grilled? And so on. Okay? So let's contrast that with a meal ready to eat, a combat ration meal. So applying Douglas's deciphering a meal system to an MRE, we see that there is no weekly or daily menu. There's no breakfast, there's no lunch, there's no dinner. All these meals really are exactly the same, and they're just eaten 3 times a day. Certainly no birthday MREs. Okay. Um, they're firstly broken down into ration type. And as you can see, these are broken down according to specific purposes. The most common one is the individual MRE, but then we have some specific ones for cold weather, etc., in particular regions. And then, of course, one that we've already mentioned for specific religious demographics in the military. Um, There are no courses, as we've seen. We've seen there's 24 menus, and uh, there are no courses, but what are called components. Components is one of the most frequently used words in the corpus. There are 603 tokens out of the 175,000 word corpus. And components refer to any food item. Components can be in any order. And when you think about that, think about an airline meal. You get your airline meal, and how do you eat it? Is there a particular fixed way that you conform to? Probably not. Probably most people go about airline meals in a totally different way to Mary Douglas's family back in London in 1971. Our fourth concept for looking at the notion of combat ready rations is the notion of individualization. One example of the process of individualization is to think of the segmentation of objects. Think about, for example, how we go from a bench, a shared seating, to a chair, individual seating. We can also see individualization with respect to the idea of individual servings and with respect to food, which the OAD dates as recently as the beginning of the 1800s. The role of individual servings has always been important in combat foods, but has increasingly become more important, and the use of the word individual is one of the most frequent words in the corpus, along with components, 581 tokens out of 175,000 words approximately. In its more abstract sense, individualization is seen as the growing autonomy of individuals freed from traditional social obligations. So we no longer are tied as closely as we used to extended families, to village communities, to religions, to particular ranks or genders. So that gives us a greater individual freedom and a reduction of the kinds of obligations that being a member of a group brings. Um, in to give you a better example of that, think about um, the kinds of things that, like the gig economy. Today, individuals have greater choices, and one of those choices is not to be part of a company, um, not to be part of any kind of organized labor, but to be an independent freelance worker. And something like 40% of the labor force these days is considered to be an independent freelance worker. The gig economy. Think of things like Uber and Airbnb. These all emphasizes individual choices and remove from a larger membership of a larger structure. With regard to the relationship between individualization and eating, um, we can begin to look at eating in terms of a couple of axes. So we're going here from shared to individual, and also in terms of preparation from scratch to industrially processed food. What we're interested in here is the particular quadrant in the bottom right, and the individual consumption of industrially prepared food, especially in the situation of work, sports, and gaming. So the cubicle worker you see there with her eating her salad next to her computer while she's working is exercising a much greater autonomy to choose when and how to eat. And that is the nature of individualization with regard to food. One of those choices that cubicle worker might make is Soylent, and Soylent is a meal replacement shake. Um, it's interesting to look at these two pictures. The one at the top is taken from a recent ad for Soylent. It looks very much like a picnic, and there's a rug on the grass and a dog. But two of the people are actually enjoying a bottle of what Soylent calls deliciously neutral Soylent. Um, it's a very unusually social scene for silent drinkers. In fact, it's a kind of a contradiction in many ways, and it kind of gets at the notion of individualization uh, within, which was still part of a larger grouping of people. And so this is trying to soften the individuality of silent drinkers. And I want you to look at that and compare that um, with a scene from Spike Jonze's Her. Um, like the silent ad, it looks like a typical social event of a picnic of three people. But there are actually two couples in the movie. But there are actually two couples in the movie. Theodore Twombly, that's Joaquin Phoenix, has fallen in love with his operating system, who calls herself Samantha. And in this scene, he is there with Samantha on his phone in his top pocket so she can see and participate in the foursome, uh, as similar to two traditional couples. So the need for human relationship, with all its emotional messiness, has been replaced by a digital companion in the same way, the exact same way that our need for food in the form of a meal, um, with all its time, stress, and mess, has been replaced by a meal replacement shake. So, how can we sum this all up then? It's ironic that Soylent was created by a bunch of guys. Rob Reinhardt was one of them, in a pretty rundown apartment in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco, just across the bay from what many people consider the mecca of recreational food, that is Chez Panisse in Berkeley. Um, Rob Reinhardt, the founder of Soylent, sees the expansion of feeding, uh, but also stresses the resilience of traditional eating. So, this is what he says on his webpage. We'll see a separation between our meals for utility and function and our meals for experience and socialization, or recreational food. So, we've always had this separation. But we might begin to ask ourselves whether the impact of combat ready food and its civilian counterparts has furthered this separation, whether the future of food is solitary and functional rather than social and recreational. Are we doomed to more solitary eating of industrially produced and prepared combat work, leisure ready rations, as our lives become increasingly individualized? It's interesting to note a quote from Fleming here. Fleming says, for most people, most of the time, eating is not a solitary act devoid of social meaning or relations. It can involve many layers of meaning: physical, social, emotional, economic, and political. In fact, Fleming goes on to say that it's the basic of civility and the basis of democracy in our society that we actually sit down and eat together. What happens if we're not sitting down and eating together? What if we're consuming or feeding individually? What if we're feeding individually while we are working or playing and have no kinds of relationship with other individuals? So, in wrapping up, we're left with a question: is the civilian adaptation of warfighter feeding, that is solitary eating, increasing and becoming the norm? If so, what are the implications for social life, civility, and indeed for food? As everything becomes more individualized, is feeding all that will be left of food in the future? What will happen to dining?